April 1943. German pilots looked up, saw this shape in the sky, and started laughing. They called it a flying milk bottle. Too big, too slow, too clumsy to survive a single dogfight. For a while, the laughing made sense. Then it stopped. Not gradually. This is the story of exactly when and exactly why the Luftwaffe went quiet.
On that Tuesday morning, 16 P-47C Thunderbolts from the 4th Fighter Group lifted off from RAF Debden and crossed the Channel for the first time as combat aircraft. The German pilots who spotted them above Dieppe had a reaction that was uniform and immediate. They could not stop laughing. Oberleutnant Ralph Hermischen of Jagdgeschwader 2 got on the radio and said what every man in his formation was thinking. He called them flying milk bottles. The name spread through the Luftwaffe before the day was over.
He was not wrong about what he saw. The P-47 was enormous. 13,500 pounds gross weight. Nearly twice the mass of the Spitfire the Americans had been expected to replace. Its fuselage was shaped like a barrel. Its greenhouse canopy sat on top of that barrel like a glass dome on a boiler. Its propeller threw an 11-foot arc through the air. From the seat of a Fokker-Wulf at altitude, it looked less like a fighter than a large and confused mistake. What Hermischen could not see from his cockpit was what that shape contained. 8 Browning M2 heavy machine guns, 4 per wing, loaded with 3,400 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition. A combined rate of fire that delivered 100 projectiles per second through a convergent zone the diameter of a dinner table at 300 yards. When all 8 fired together, they did not shoot at an aircraft so much as erase it from the airspace it had been occupying.
By May 1945, the Luftwaffe that laughed at the milk bottle was gone. Not beaten back, gone. Dissolved into grounded aircraft and empty fuel drums, and a generation of pilots who had not lived to see the armistice. The P-47 Thunderbolt had not simply won its corner of the air war. It had participated, systematically and irreversibly, in the destruction of the most combat-experienced fighter force in the history of aviation. The story of how it did this is, at its core, the story of a design philosophy that looked like an error and turned out to be a theorem. But before we talk about what the Thunderbolt became, we have to talk about what it was. Because what it was, in the spring of 1943, was a machine that scared its own pilots more than it scared the Germans.
The 56th Fighter Group had been training on P-47s since September 1942. By January 1943, when they shipped out to England, they had lost 18 pilots and 41 aircraft. Not in combat, in training. The P-47 had a torque roll that could flip it inverted on takeoff if a pilot advanced the throttle too quickly. It ground-looped on landing with a thoroughness that the maintenance crews came to regard as personal.
and at high speed in a dive, the controls stopped responding entirely. The phenomenon had a name the pilots did not yet know: compressibility. Past roughly 500 miles per hour in a dive, shock waves formed across the control surfaces. The ailerons locked. The elevator locked. The aircraft became a very fast, very heavy object with one trajectory. Several pilots discovered this and did not come back. The ones who survived pulled at the stick and felt nothing, waited, prayed, and felt the controls return somewhere below 20,000 feet, with the ground filling the windscreen.
Hub Zemke, commanding the 56th, was a lean, deliberate man from Missoula, Montana, who had flown Hurricanes with Soviet pilots and studied every aircraft the Luftwaffe had in any document he could access. He did not panic, but sitting in the operations hut at Bridgeport, Connecticut, reading his 4th fatal accident report in 6 weeks, he allowed himself to conclude that the Army Air Forces had given him a machine designed to kill Americans. The pilots of the 4th Fighter Group agreed with this assessment. Most of them were former Eagle Squadron volunteers who had already flown Spitfires in combat with the RAF. The transition from a Spitfire to a P-47 was, by their account, something like being moved from a sports car into a municipal bus. A bus that occasionally rolled on its side without warning.
The RAF watched from a polite distance and suggested, in the language of military liaison, that perhaps the Americans might wish to reconsider. British pilots had a joke. The only evasive maneuver available in a P-47 was to unbuckle your harness and run laps around the cockpit. The cockpit was, in fact, large enough that this was geometrically possible. This did not help. The performance comparison was honest and unflattering. The Focke-Wulf 190A5, which was the primary German fighter the Thunderbolt would meet over France, climbed at over 3,500 feet per minute at sea level. It could turn inside the P-47 at every altitude below 25,000 feet. Its armament, 2 20mm cannon and 2 13mm machine guns, could destroy a fighter in a fraction of a second of accurate fire. The German pilots who met the Thunderbolts in April 1943 had been flying combat since 1939. Some units had collective victory totals that exceeded the entire flying strength of some Allied nations.
And yet, the men who would be dead within 2 years because of the Thunderbolt were, in April of 1943, laughing. The laugh was not irrational. It was based on real information. The Thunderbolt really could not turn with the Focke-Wulf. It really could not climb with it at low altitude. Everything the German pilots believed about the aircraft was true. What they did not understand was that it had been built to answer a completely different question. The question every other fighter in the sky in 1943 was trying to answer was, how do you build a fighter that can defeat the enemy fighter in a turning engagement? The question Alexander Kartveli had been trying to answer was different. He was trying to build a fighter that did not need to turn at all.
Kartveli was born in Tiflis in 1896, in what is now the nation of Georgia. He studied engineering in Paris, emigrated to the United States in 1927, and joined Seversky Aircraft Corporation, which would become Republic Aviation, with a conviction about American industrial capacity that he never revised. He spent the late 1930s building increasingly powerful aircraft, each one faster and heavier than the last. In June 1940, with German armour cutting through France, the Army Air Corps issued a requirement for a high-altitude interceptor. Kartveli read the specifications and concluded that meeting them required a design philosophy none of his competitors were considering. The problem was altitude. To maintain engine power at 30,000 feet, where the air is too thin to support normal combustion, you needed a supercharger. Every other high-altitude fighter used a mechanical supercharger, driven by the engine's own crankshaft. Kartveli decided to use a turbo supercharger, driven instead by the engine's exhaust gases, with the ability to maintain sea-level density air in the combustion chambers all the way to 35,000 feet.
The turbo supercharger was not a device you bolted into an existing engine bay. It was a system. A turbine wheel, an intercooler, and a series of ducting passages that ran the exhaust forward and returned compressed air to the engine. In the P-47, this system occupied the entire rear fuselage. The aircraft was built around the supercharger. This is why it was shaped like a barrel. The barrel was not an aesthetic choice. It was the structural consequence of a bet on altitude. The XP-47B first flew on May 6, 1941. The test pilot, Lowry Brobham, landed and submitted a report that used the word staggering twice. At altitude, the aircraft was an entirely different machine than it appeared on the ground. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, an 18-cylinder twin-row radial producing 2,000 horsepower, maintained full power output at altitudes where German fighters were gasping. In a dive, it accelerated past 500 miles per hour, faster than any other aircraft in the test program. The engineers immediately began redesigning the control surfaces. Nothing was supposed to go that fast. The weight, which everyone noticed and many used as a point of derision, turned out to produce an advantage that had not been fully predicted. The Thunderbolt's structure was overbuilt beyond what its specifications required. The wing spars could support loads 3 times the aircraft's gross weight. The engine mount absorbed forces the aircraft was never expected to encounter. The fuel cells were housed in thick-walled containers. The control cables were doubled throughout. When .30 caliber bullets struck the Pratt & Whitney cylinders, they often did not penetrate. When 20mm shells hit the wing sometimes kept flying. This was not armor. This was the structural consequence of building a machine heavy enough to absorb what Kartveli suspected it would be asked to absorb. The armament decision was deliberate, and in the view of every European Air Force that observed it, wrong. Kartveli's team considered cannon, preferred by the Luftwaffe, the RAF, and every other established fighter tradition, and chose not to fit it. Not because cannon was inadequate, but because the ammunition ran out too quickly. A 20mm cannon in a German fighter carried between 100 and 200 rounds. At combat firing rates, that gave a skilled pilot perhaps 5 seconds of trigger time total. Kartveli put 8.50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns in the wings instead, each with 425 rounds. The total available trigger time was over 30 seconds. In aerial combat, where a firing pass typically lasts less than 2 seconds, 30 seconds of available fire is an almost inconceivable operational advantage. The .5 caliber round itself was something German intelligence never adequately assessed. The Browning's projectile weighed 1.8 ounces, travelled at 2,900 feet per second, and was loaded in a pattern: armor-piercing, incendiary, armor-piercing, incendiary tracer, ball, that ensured structural penetration followed by combustion. It was not the spectacular explosive impact of a cannon shell. It was sustained, precise, industrial destruction. An aircraft caught in the convergence zone of 8 guns at 300 yards was not usually given an opportunity to leave it.
None of this was visible to the German pilots in April 1943. What was visible was a fat American fighter that couldn't turn, couldn't climb, and looked from altitude like a mistake. Josef Pips Priller, commanding JG-26, sent a combat assessment to headquarters after the first month of engagements that described the P-47 as, in his words, meat for the slaughter. The American groups lost 14 aircraft in their first month of operations, for 3 confirmed German kills. The numbers were as damning as the contempt.
What the kill ratio did not capture was an anomaly appearing consistently in the maintenance records. The P-47s that went down had absorbed damage that, by any engineering standard applied to German or British aircraft, should have ended their flights many minutes earlier. One aircraft returned from a May 4th mission with an engine mechanics could insert their fingers into through the bullet holes. The maintenance log recorded 21 20mm cannon impacts and more than 100 100 caliber machine gun strikes. The hydraulic system had been empty since somewhere over Belgium. The aircraft had kept flying because the R2800 radial engine had no coolant. There was nothing to puncture, and when cylinders were destroyed, the remaining cylinders kept running.
The Messerschmitt 109 was a precision instrument. A single 50 caliber round through the coolant jacket could bring it down in minutes. The Focke-Wulf 190's fuel system was vulnerable in ways the Thunderbolt's was not. German pilots who returned from engagements with P-47s and filed damage reports began by May 1943 using a word that appeared in no assessment of any other Allied fighter: confusion. They were confused about why the aircraft they had clearly, demonstrably shot to pieces were still in the air. Hub Zemke understood the problem from the other direction. His pilots were flying the P-47 like a Spitfire, turning, maneuvering at medium altitude, fighting the Focke-Wulf in the envelope where the Focke-Wulf excelled. He spent April and May in focused frustration, debriefing pilots at the end of each mission day, reviewing gun camera film frame by frame, calculating loss rates against altitude bands, and working toward a tactical conclusion he could already see in the numbers, but had not yet proven in the air.
The understanding arrived through a near catastrophe. On June 26, 1943, a formation from the 61st Fighter Squadron was returning from escort duty when it was bounced by Focke-Wulfs of JG-26, led by Oberleutnant Wilhelm Ferdinand Galland, the younger brother of General Adolf Galland. The Germans came in from above and behind at diving speed through the formation, scattering it. The pilot at the rear, the most exposed position in any fighter formation, took the worst of the first pass.
Second Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson from Wichita Falls, Texas, had been in combat for 7 weeks. He was 22 years old, a farm boy who had learned to fly on a grass strip and who had concluded in his early missions over the Channel that the P-47 was probably going to kill him before the Germans got a clear shot. On June 26th, the Focke-Wulfs took his canopy, his hydraulics, and his engine cowling in the first 3 seconds of contact. Something behind his instrument panel caught fire. He reached for the canopy release. The mechanism had been jammed by a 20mm shell impact. He was sealed inside a burning aircraft at 27,000 feet.
What followed has been reconstructed from Johnson's combat report, his 1958 memoir, and the surviving records of 2nd Peloton of JG-26. Johnson, unable to see through an oil-coated windscreen, his controls barely responding to a hydraulic system that was empty, his engine shuddering on every stroke, pointed the wreck west toward England and held the stick. The P-47 kept flying. Not well, not reliably, but it kept flying. A lone Focke-Wulf found it limping across the Channel at under 170 miles per hour. The German pilot, whose identity has never been definitively confirmed despite decades of research, positioned behind Johnson and began shooting. Methodically, with his cannon first, then, when the cannon was exhausted, with his machine guns. Johnson could not evade. He crouched behind the steel plate behind his seat and prayed for something to stop. Nothing stopped. The plate held. The engine kept turning. The R-2800, running on God and momentum, dragged the wreck east to west across the water. The German pilot ran out of ammunition. He pulled alongside. He looked at Johnson through what remained of the shattered canopy. By Johnson's account, his expression shifted from professional focus to something resembling disbelief. He shook his head. He gave what Johnson described as an informal salute. Then he peeled away, presumably because there was nothing left in his wings to fire. Johnson landed at Manston with the engine failing on the rollout. His crew chief stopped counting bullet holes at 200. Structural analysis later found that 3 of the 4 main longerons, the backbone of the fuselage, had been partially severed. The engine had taken direct hits. 3 of the control cables were intact only by the margin that defines the difference between a pilot's memoir and a casualty report. The aircraft was scrapped. Johnson was back in a cockpit in 4 days. He went on to score 27 aerial victories, the second highest total among American aces in the European theatre. On the day that made him a footnote in the history of aerial gunnery, he had survived not through skill, but through the decision Alexander Kartveli had made in Farmingdale, New York, 3 years earlier, to build a machine that could absorb that much punishment without surrendering. Johnson's survival sent electricity through 8th Fighter Command. The maintenance reports that followed the aircraft, filed with the thoroughness that characterized American logistics, described damage that a Luftwaffe 3 intelligence officer initially refused to accept. The testimony of multiple 2nd JG-26 pilots confirmed the same conclusion. The milk bottle they had been shooting at did not fall down. The officer's handwritten annotation on the translated report, preserved in the German records captured in 1945, reads, "This is incorrect." The annotation has the quality of a man who knew it was not. Zemke understood what the Johnson engagement meant beyond the individual miracle of survival. He had been building, through the brutal empiricism of the spring loss rate, a set of tactics that matched what the aircraft could actually do, rather than what a fighter was supposed to do. The Thunderbolt was not a dogfighter. It was not a turning fight machine. It was not anything the previous 20 years of fighter doctrine had described. It was, at altitude, the fastest production aircraft in the Western Allied infantry. In a dive from 30,000 feet, it was the fastest aircraft in any infantry. And it could absorb punishment that would destroy 3 European fighters and keep its pilot alive long enough to get home.
The tactics Zemke's group and others refined through the summer of 1943 built on one irreducible physical fact. Nothing in the Luftwaffe's order of battle could catch a P-47 descending from altitude. The dive was not an evasive maneuver. The dive was a weapon. A Thunderbolt descending from 30,000 feet reached speeds in excess of 500 miles per hour. Speeds at which deflection shooting became mathematically impractical for the human brain. A German pilot trying to track a diving Thunderbolt through his gun sight was solving a geometry problem faster than biological reflexes could process.
Captain Walker Bud Mahurin of the 56th Group began systematizing what became known as boom and zoom. The formation climbs to 30,000 feet above the effective operating altitude of German fighters. When Luftwaffe aircraft appear below, the Thunderbolts roll inverted and dive. The dive converts altitude to airspeed. At the bottom, the pilot either fires and breaks off, or converts the remaining energy back into altitude in a zoom climb. In the zoom, the P-2800's mass carries it upward faster than a lighter aircraft can follow. The German who pursues ends up slow and isolated at altitude, exactly where the R-2800 holds its advantage.
The German response was to concentrate on the bombers instead. The B-17s and B-24s the Thunderbolts were escorting. This made tactical sense. Destroy enough bombers, and the daylight campaign stops regardless of fighter losses. But reaching the bombers required passing through the escort, and by July 1943, the escort had learned how to kill. Francis Gabreski, a Polish-American pilot from Oil City, Pennsylvania, who would end the war as the top-scoring American ace in Europe at 28 victories, described the shift in a post-war interview. In July of 1943, he said, German pilots stopped being confident and started being careful. He said it in the same flat, factual tone he had used to file his combat reports, which may be why it sounds so final. The August 17th mission to Schweinfurt and Regensburg was the deepest Allied penetration into Germany attempted to that date. The Thunderbolts had the range to escort the bombers only part way. The aircraft's internal fuel gave roughly 90 minutes of combat time, enough to the German border, but not to the target and back. The unescorted bombers paid a catastrophic price in the middle leg. But in the segments where the P-47 escort was present, the Luftwaffe units that attacked were cut apart. Major David Schilling led 4 Thunderbolts of the 62nd Fighter Squadron against a formation of Messerschmitt 110 heavy fighters, positioning to fire their unguided rockets into the B-17 stream from outside gun range. In under 60 seconds, 8 of the twin-engine aircraft were destroyed. Unteroffizier Heinrich Roth, a gunner in one of the 110s who survived as a prisoner,
described it years later in an interview. "The Americans came from above and behind," he said, "faster than we could turn to meet them. The shells from their guns were not individual hits, it was a wall. The aircraft in front of me, 2 men I had served with for 14 months, ceased to exist. Not shot down, ceased to exist. I counted 2 seconds.
The Schweinfurt mission crystallized what the summer's engagements had been building toward. The P-47's armament, dismissed as inferior to cannon by every European air force, was not inferior. It was different. Cannon fire was precise and limited, explosive shells requiring accurate aim, exhausting in seconds, with spectacular but sometimes superficial structural effect. The 8.50 caliber guns created a probability field. At convergence distance, a pilot did not need precision. He needed to point the aircraft at the target and sustain the trigger. German aircraft that entered that convergence zone were not damaged. They were structurally dissolved. Hans Philipp met the altitude problem fatally on October 8, 1943. He was one of Germany's most decorated fighter aces, with 206 confirmed aerial victories across 2 fronts, a figure that places him among the 10 highest-scoring pilots in the history of aerial warfare. He was commanding Jagdgeschwader 1 and leading a formation against a B-17 raid near Bremen when P-47s of the 56th Group found him at 28,000 feet. At that altitude, his BMW 801 engine was oxygen-starved and sluggish. Robert Johnson, now an experienced pilot with multiple victories and a very specific institutional knowledge of what a Thunderbolt could survive, was flying at 31,000 feet. His combat report was 3 sentences. He described the angle, the range, and the result. Philipp's aircraft exploded. There was no parachute. Philipp's death shook the Luftwaffe in a way that accumulated kill totals sometimes do not. It was not the number that mattered. It was what the number meant. If a man who had flown over 500 combat missions on 2 fronts and survived everything the Soviet Air Force and the RAF could aim at him could not survive a P-47 at altitude, what did that communicate about the altitude problem? The German High Command ordered a comprehensive technical assessment. The report landed on Goering's desk in November 1943. The conclusion? The Thunderbolt's service ceiling exceeded any German fighter's reach. Its dive speed approached the boundary of controllable flight. Its structural resilience defied the damage models German engineers had applied for 3 years. The recommendation was to avoid engaging P-47s above 25,000 feet. The problem was that P-47s were beginning to be everywhere below that line as well. The paddle blade propeller arrived in January 1944 on the P-47 D-22 and changed the aircraft in a single upgrade. Republic's engineers had been working the climb rate problem for 18 months. The standard propeller was optimized for high-speed efficiency at altitude, narrow blades designed for minimum drag at 500 miles per hour. The paddle blade design widened the chord dramatically, sacrificing some top speed for far greater bite at low speed. At sea level, the modification added nearly 1,000 feet per minute to the climb rate. At 20,000 feet, the improvement was more pronounced. The aircraft that had struggled to altitude now climbed at rates that matched or exceeded the Focke-Wulf 190.
In many pilots' accounts, the paddle-blade Thunderbolt felt, for the first time, like it was trying to be somewhere.
Heinz Knoke, a Jagdgeschwader 11 veteran with over 200 combat missions, who survived the war and wrote one of the most carefully observed pilot memoirs of the conflict, encountered the new variants in February 1944 during a bomber intercept near Hanover. He noted in his diary, with the precision he applied to all his entries, that the fat American fighters had learned to climb. His wingman was killed in that engagement. His next entry is brief. The psychological transformation in the Luftwaffe during early 1944 is documented in the interrogation files at Oberursel, the German facility where captured Allied aircrew were debriefed. The files on individual Allied aircraft types, updated continuously as new information arrived, show the P-47's trajectory through official German assessment with a clarity no post-war analysis has improved on. April 1943, minimal threat. December 1943, significant threat above 25,000 feet. June 1944, critical threat at all altitudes. March 1945, unsurvivable in direct engagement.
The range problem was solved by drop tanks, external fuel pods releasing from the wing pylons when empty. With two 108-gallon wing tanks, the Thunderbolt's combat radius extended past 1,000 miles. This allowed P-47 groups to escort bombers to Berlin and beyond. As P-51 Mustangs began arriving in volume and taking over the deepest escort missions, where their superior fuel efficiency at cruise altitude gave them an edge the Thunderbolt could not quite match, the P-47 did not step aside. It found a different role. What it did in that role was, by some measures, the most consequential contribution any single aircraft type made to the Allied victory in Europe.
By the spring of 1944, a P-47D in ground attack configuration carried 1,000 pounds of bombs under each wing and 500 pounds on the centerline, a bomb load exceeding the capacity of early war medium bombers. Later variants added zero-length rocket stubs for 10 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rockets, each equivalent in blast effect to a 105mm artillery shell. The machine that German pilots had called a milk bottle in 1943 was in 1944 the most capable close air support platform in the Western Allied arsenal. And on a Tuesday morning in June, it was going to prove it over a strip of Norman coastline, against a military that had been moving armies across Europe for 4 years.
June 6, 1944. The 9th Air Force put more than 500 P-47s over the Normandy beaches before dawn, in layered formations from sea level to 30,000 feet. The Luftwaffe, which had promised Hitler it would contest the invasion air corridor, sent aircraft to the beaches in the first hours. Most were turned back before they sighted the coastline. Those that broke through found Thunderbolts at every altitude. Oberleutnant Wolfgang Fischer of JG-2, one of 3 German pilots who reached the beaches that morning, filed a combat report that survives in the records captured in 1945. He had entered the mission with 12 aircraft. He was the only pilot who returned. In the weeks following the landing, P-47 groups of the 9th Air Force began a systematic destruction of the German military's ability to move in daylight. The target was everything that moved. Locomotives pulling supply trains, truck columns on Norman roads, horse-drawn ammunition carts on the lanes between villages, armored vehicles in the orchards the Wehrmacht used as staging areas, fuel depots, railway switching yards, and bridges.
The destruction was accomplished with rockets, bombs, and, most efficient against soft targets, the 8 guns. A 2-second trigger pull from a P-47 at optimal range put 160 half-inch projectiles into a target zone the size of a truck. It did not damage the truck. It unmade it.
Hans von Luck, commanding the 125th Panzer Grenadier Regiment during the fighting in Normandy, described the attacks in his post-war memoir. "They came low," he wrote, "low enough that men on the ground could see the pilots' faces. The sound arrived before the aircraft, a deep mechanical thunder different from anything else in the Allied infantry, one that experienced soldiers could identify from 2 kilometers away. Then the guns. Then the columns ceased to exist." Von Luck noted that his regiment began positioning individual foxholes alongside every vehicle, large enough for 1 man, close enough to reach in 3 seconds. When the Thunderbolts appeared, the vehicle was abandoned. Survival meant distance from anything recognizable. The Germans had a name for them: Jabos, Jagdbombers, fighter bombers, but the word had acquired a specific meaning that went beyond the mission category. In the Norman hedgerows, on the Seine crossings, along the roads through the Falaise pocket, Jabo had become a sound word. It described a particular auditory experience, a deepening roar from the south, followed by the hammering of guns, followed by silence from whatever had been in the road. Wehrmacht commanders who had moved armoured columns freely across France in 1940 could no longer maintain supply lines in daylight. Fuel convoys were destroyed before they reached the forward units. Ammunition trains were derailed and strafed until they stopped burning. Medical units moved at night. The 7th Army's supply officers began routing everything: food, fuel, ammunition, reinforcements, through a nocturnal schedule that added days of delay to every resupply cycle and left the units at the front chronically short of everything they needed to conduct mobile defence.
The Falaise pocket in August 1944 demonstrated what sustained application of this kind of air power could do to a trapped formation. 2 German armies found themselves surrounded in a corridor that P-47s turned into an open-air killing ground. Aircraft came in relays, maintaining continuous presence over the pocket from first light to last. German soldiers who survived described the experience with a consistency that appears across dozens of post-war accounts. The inability to move, the inability to think, the progressive dissolution of unit cohesion under attacks that seemed to come from every quadrant simultaneously. The loss of equipment in the Falaise pocket was so severe that the units that escaped, and many did escape, emerged as walking infantry with no vehicles, no artillery, and no organic transport. They were not defeated formations. They were disbanded ones. The statistics from the 9th Air Force's campaign: 651 locomotives, nearly 4,000 trucks, 500 tanks and armoured vehicles, 4,000 horse-drawn vehicles destroyed in June alone, are figures that resist comfortable comprehension. They represent the systematic removal of an army's logistical nervous system in 30 days. The Wehrmacht that fought the Normandy breakout and the race to the German border was fighting without a functional supply structure, under constant air attack, against an enemy with an unlimited surfeit of the fuel, ammunition, and reinforcement it was consistently being denied.
Behind every one of those missions was a production line. Republic Aviation's Farmingdale plant on Long Island completed one P-47 per hour at peak production, around the clock, every day. The Evansville, Indiana facility, built on empty farmland beginning in 1942, was producing 500 aircraft per month by mid-1944. By the time Republic closed the production line at the war's end, the total count was 15,683 aircraft. This exceeded the entire fighter production of several European nations across the entire duration of the conflict.
Each of those aircraft was not a simple machine. The R-2800 engine contained 2,400 individually machined components held to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. The airframe required 65,000 individual parts and 8 miles of electrical wiring. The ammunition feed system alone, 8 separate boxes, 8 electric boost motors, 8 heating coils to prevent freezing at altitude, was a precision mechanism that had to function reliably after hours of flight at 40 degrees below zero. And yet American workers, many of them women who had never been inside an aircraft factory before December 1941, assembled these machines faster and to tighter quality standards than the facilities the Luftwaffe had been operating for a decade. The factories were staffed by people reading technical manuals rather than carrying institutional knowledge, and they outproduced the institutions.
The pilot training gap is the comparison that cannot be argued away. By 1944, American pilots arriving in the European theatre had logged a minimum of 400 flight hours before their first combat mission. Many had 500 or more. They had trained on gun camera footage, practiced deflection shooting against towed targets, studied intelligence photographs of German aircraft subvariants until they could identify the differences from half a mile. They had flown formation at night. They had practiced instrument approaches in weather that grounded their instructors. They had, in some training programs, flown against captured German aircraft.
German pilots entering combat in 1944, fighting against mounting losses and an increasingly compressed training pipeline, were often going to their first missions with fewer than 100 hours total flight time. Some had 50. The gap between 400 hours of structured training and 50 hours of rushed qualification did not manifest as a slight tactical disadvantage. It manifested as a difference between a pilot who recognized a boom and zoom attack while there was still time to react, and a pilot who recognized it in the second before impact.
Operation Bodenplatte on January 1st, 1945, was the Luftwaffe's attempt to destroy Allied air power on the ground. Nearly 900 German fighters, the largest single concentration of German air power since the Battle of Britain, attacked Allied airfields across Belgium and the Netherlands simultaneously at first light. At some fields, the attack succeeded. At Y-34 near Metz, home of the 365th Fighter Group, 22 P-47s were destroyed on the ground along with other aircraft. A captured German pilot, brought to the operations center while the wreckage was still smoking, pointed at the burning aircraft and said something about American losses. The group commander, Major George Brooking, pointed to the flight line, where mechanics were already moving wreckage aside and marking hard stands for replacements. He told the prisoner that by tomorrow there would be 40 new ones.
Then he asked how long it would take Germany to replace its pilots.
The German pilot's expression, according to every American officer present who wrote about the exchange, contained no answer. Brooking was accurate. Factory-fresh P-47 D-40s were landing at Y-34 within 48 hours, ferried in from depots in England. The Luftwaffe's 900 aircraft had cost it 271 planes and 213 pilots in Bodenplatte, including many flight instructors and squadron leaders who had been flying since 1939. These were the men the training pipeline depended on to produce the next generation. Germany had no mechanism to replace them. America replaced the aircraft in 2 days. The arithmetic of industrial warfare is not subtle. In the Pacific Theater, the 348th Fighter Group operating from New Guinea discovered that the Thunderbolt's qualities translated directly to a different enemy's vulnerabilities. Japanese pilots who encountered P-47s over New Guinea described them in terms nearly identical to those the Luftwaffe had used in 1943. Machines that absorbed damage that should have been fatal, and whose return fire was terrifying in a way the language of military reporting struggles to contain. Saburo Sakai, Japan's most celebrated surviving ace, wrote after the war that the Thunderbolt's guns were streams of heavy bullets that tore aircraft apart. He used the word terrifying. He had survived being shot through the skull at low altitude and flying 4 hours back to base on one eye and sheer will. His assessment of terrifying means something different from the same word used by a pilot who had seen less.
The Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter, with a top speed of 540 miles per hour, should have been untouchable by propeller-driven aircraft. P-47 pilots discovered 2 exceptions. Jets were vulnerable during takeoff and landing, and jets were vulnerable to a diving Thunderbolt that had traded altitude for energy. On November 27, 1944, Lieutenant Colonel John C. Meyer of the 352nd Fighter Group dove from 28,000 feet onto an Me-262 in level flight and caught it. His guns opened at 400 yards. The aircraft disintegrated. By early 1945, specialized P-47M variants with water methanol injection were reaching 470 miles per hour in level flight, fast enough to intercept jets that had slowed to attack bombers. The machines that were supposed to save Germany from Allied air superiority were being destroyed by an aircraft that German pilots had called a joke 24 months earlier.
Josef Priller, the same officer who had called the Thunderbolts flying milk bottles in April 1943, survived the war and was interviewed by German propaganda officials in March 1945. His statement was deemed too demoralizing to publish. He described the Thunderbolt as the finest fighter bomber ever built. He described its armament as weapons that never jammed and never ran out of ammunition in any normal combat engagement. He described what it represented: unlimited production, pilots trained past the point their German counterparts could aspire to, fuel and ammunition in quantities that exceeded any rational accounting, as delayed defeat expressed in mechanical form. He said no one was laughing in 1945. The German propaganda ministry buried the statement. The American records preserved it. Adolf Galland flew a captured P-47 after the war and gave an account of the experience in a recorded interview decades later. He described the power, the visibility, the precision of the controls. He said he understood, sitting in that cockpit, why the aircraft had defeated the Luftwaffe. Not because it was a better dogfighter. It was not. Not because its pilots were individually superior. In some measures, they were not. Because it could be built in the thousands, flown by pilots who had been trained in months rather than years, maintained in combat conditions by mechanics who had learned their trade in weeks, and sent back into the air the next morning, as reliably as the sun came up. He said the sound of the 8 guns, which the German pilots had named Roosevelt's piano, was a sound that haunted the men who heard it. He said many of them heard it only once.
Republic Aviation produced 15,683 P-47 Thunderbolts. In Europe, those aircraft destroyed approximately 3,752 enemy aircraft in the air, 3,315 on the ground, 86,000 railway cars, 9,000 locomotives, 6,000 armored vehicles, and 68,000 trucks. The 9th Air Force flew 213,873 combat sorties and expended 135 million rounds of .50 caliber ammunition. The aircraft achieved a 4.6 to 1 kill ratio in aerial combat, while maintaining the lowest loss rate of any Allied fighter bomber in the theatre. These are production records, not metaphors.
The German pilots also deserve acknowledgement, not for what their service meant historically, but for what they were. Hans Philipp flew over 500 combat missions and was killed by an aircraft operating at an altitude his own engine could not properly sustain. Heinz Knocker flew the entire war and survived, and wrote a memoir that remains one of the most carefully observed accounts of what it felt like to watch an air war turn against you. Priller survived, flew commercial aviation in the post-war years, and died in 1961. By all accounts, he never mentioned the milk bottle comment again. What the P-47 Thunderbolt proved, and what it proved alongside the Thatch Weave, alongside the M1 Garand, alongside the production schedules at Willow Run and the training programs at Randolph Field, was the same proposition in a different form. A system built for replication defeats a system built for perfection, given sufficient time and scale. The Luftwaffe built the finest individual fighter pilots in the history of the art. It built aircraft that were, in specific envelopes, genuinely superior to anything the Allies could put up. It built a doctrine that had won in Poland, in France, in the opening phase of the Battle of Britain. And it was defeated by something that did not need to do any of those things better. It was defeated by something that could be built by the thousands, flown by men who had been farmers and students and factory workers 6 months earlier, and kept flying long past the point when the excellence that opposed it had been used up. In April 1943, over northern France, a German ace looked at a barrel-shaped American fighter and called it a milk bottle. By May 1945, the sky over Germany was filled with milk bottles, and there was no one left who remembered when it had seemed funny. The Thunderbolt didn't win because it was the best fighter in the sky. It won because it was built to answer a question nobody else was asking.
That's the Arsenal Files. If this earned a place in your feed, the subscribe button is right there. It tells the algorithm this kind of content is worth making more of. Drop a comment below. Which detail from this story hit hardest? The Johnson engagement, the armament decision, or something else? I read every one.